As the elevator doors opened on the floor where my department was located, I stepped out with confidence. The moment I spotted my manager, Michael, I called out loudly, "Michael!" I'd just cleared up the misunderstanding with the client. After delivering my report, I noticed a familiar face. That face turned to look at me, too. There's no way she would remember me. Even if she did, there's no way she'd recognize a plain-looking Japanese man who's now aged into an ordinary middle-aged face. But to my surprise, the blonde beauty rushed over to me. "My name is James. I'm 37 years old. I joined this company mid-career, but my sales performance has been poor. Every day, I endure Michael's scolding, 'Hey, do you understand the situation? You need to start delivering results.'" Michael ran his hand through his hair and sighed. "You said during your interview that you were passionate about working here, which is why I hired you. So how come you can't close any deals? Honestly, I'd like to know the answer to that myself. I am passionate. I want to secure contracts and sell our products for the company's sake. But for some reason, my enthusiasm seems to backfire. When I'm in front of clients, I can't say what I need to say. And it never leads to a signed deal. I can barely manage to say half of what I practiced. No matter how many simulations I run or how much I rehearse at home, as soon as I realize the client is about to make a decision, I freeze. The result is always the same. You're just not cut out for sales. Maybe you should think about switching careers. I've thought the same thing myself. Sales isn't my strong suit." But I still bowed my head deeply and said, "No, I want to keep trying. Please, give me another chance." Michael let out another sigh. "Since you can't close deals, I have to do it myself. If you keep dragging your feet, you might end up getting fired. I'll go handle some cold calls. You stay here and finish up that paperwork." With that, Michael left the office for an unplanned sales call. I bowed deeply to his retreating back and turned to work on the documents. This kind of work, I'm actually good at. Frustration and a sense of futility filled me as I thought about how I couldn't contribute to the company's profits as a salesperson. Still, I've got to do my best. For the company's sake. I will. I murmured to myself as I returned to work. Months passed after that. With some help from Michael, I started to secure contracts here and there. Even so, compared to my colleagues, my performance was still far behind. However, the small successes gave me a bit of confidence, and I found myself panicking less during client meetings. Michael even remarked, "Looks like you're finally getting the hang of it," which made me incredibly happy. One day, an unusual morning meeting was called. Listen up. The CEO from the US is visiting next week. My heart skipped a beat when I heard that. Apparently, they're coming because the post-acquisition performance has fallen below expectations. They'll be conducting a review to identify issues. It's a deeply embarrassing visit for us. Michael's words silenced the murmurs in the room. For the next week, work yourselves to the bone and boost those numbers, even a little. This is an American company now. Be ready for the possibility that they might decide to cut us loose if they find us unnecessary. Straightening up at Michael's words, we all replied firmly. The company had been acquired by an American firm a year ago. I joined after the acquisition, but most of my department had been here since before. They told me they were nervous about restructuring and layoffs at first, but things stayed relatively unchanged until now. But this sudden visit from the CEO, and for such a reason, poor performance, put everyone on edge. Naturally, my own targets were raised higher than ever before. The CEO may have turned a blind eye up until now, but this is a situation serious enough to bring them here personally. Get those contracts signed no matter what. Do you understand? At Michael's stern order, I hurriedly left the department. I threw myself into sales with everything I had. I wanted to bring back results that would reassure the CEO, even if only slightly. With that determination, I tackled countless cold calls, something I was still far from comfortable with. The results? Better than usual, but only slightly better. A sense of shame smoldered inside me. On top of that, Michael had the nerve to say, "For you, this is actually pretty good work." Even though my performance still didn't hold a candle to my coworkers. I clenched my teeth in frustration at my own lackluster results. The following week, the day of the CEO's visit finally arrived. The tension in the office was palpable, and I'd already worked up a sweat helping clean the premises since early morning. Amidst all this, the phone rang, and Michael answered it. Soon after, I heard him calling for me. "James! Get over here, now!" His voice echoed through the department, carrying an unmistakable urgency. It seemed there was a complaint. Apparently, the number of contracted units didn't match the number delivered. What? But, after signing the contract, I discussed with their rep and they decided to increase the order. That's what happened. Frantically trying to explain, I rifled through my desk. Here's a copy of the additional contract. I showed it to Michael, but he looked exasperated. They said they weren't aware of any additions. Just go over there and fix this. On the day the CEO was visiting, of all times. Michael cradled his head in his hands while I quickly bowed. Understood. I'll head over immediately, I said, gathering the necessary documents and rushing out of the department. I arrived at the first floor via the elevator. Near the reception desk, a crowd of people had gathered, and among them was a blonde-haired woman. Ah! A small sound escaped my lips before I could stop it. At that moment, another elevator opened, and Michael came storming out. James! Seriously, you forgot this. You can't fix anything without it. Michael was fuming, waving the additional contract in his hand. Oh. In my haste, I had apparently left the additional contract with Michael after showing it to him earlier. Pull yourself together. Take a deep breath, James. Deep breath. All right, now go. Following Michael's instructions, I took a deep breath and dashed out the door at his signal. As I moved, I thought I caught a faint trace of perfume in the air. A few hours later, I returned to the office, utterly exhausted. The person with whom I had originally finalized the additional contract had called in sick, leaving me to negotiate persistently with one of the other representatives from the earlier meeting. The image of blonde hair flickered in my mind repeatedly. Each time, it gave me a strange sense of courage. In the end, I managed to persuade them about the additional contract, and they agreed to proceed with the delivery as planned. They even saw me off with a smile. But it felt like I had poured every ounce of energy I had into the effort, leaving me utterly drained. I wanted nothing more than to head straight home, but I had to report back first. At the company's entrance, I straightened my posture, summoning what little strength I had left, and walked through the automatic doors. Riding the elevator up to my department's floor, I stepped out with determination. The moment I spotted Michael, I raised my voice. Michael! I've resolved the client's misunderstanding. After delivering my report, I noticed a familiar face. That face was looking at me, too. There's no way she remembers me. Even if she does, she wouldn't recognize a plain Japanese face that's now aged into a middle-aged one. But contrary to my expectations, the blonde beauty ran straight toward me and exclaimed, "James," before throwing her arms around me in a hug. The people around us were stunned, and I didn't understand what was happening either. I stared at her in disbelief. "Cindy, could it be, do you remember me?" I asked in English. Her eyes sparkled as she nodded emphatically. "Of course I remember. James. I've missed you. What are you doing here?" I couldn't help but smile faintly. "Sales. I wanted to be helpful to you in some way. Though, my performance has been terrible. It was only then that I noticed the stares from those around us. Embarrassed, I stepped back from Cindy and began explaining. The truth is, as a child, I had lived in the US because of my parents' work. I spent so much time abroad that I even forgot how to speak Japanese at one point. During those years, my favorite hobby was creating my own games. I loved programming. Games, which transcended language barriers, became a source of comfort for me, especially as a kid. I wanted to create games that could transcend the boundaries of countries. With that dream in my heart, I devoted myself to game development from a young age. It was during high school that I met Cindy. With her radiant blonde hair, flawless skin, and striking features, she was incredibly popular, not to mention wealthy. She was always surrounded by a group of friends, like an entourage. Honestly, she seemed like someone who existed in a completely different world from mine. One day, while I was sitting outside reading a book, Cindy passed by. Many of the students at school had never seen the colorful packed lunches that Japanese students often brought, and they were intrigued. But a few in her group pointed at me and muttered words like poor. Cindy and her friends always ate lunch in the cafeteria. It was apparently a sign of being wealthy. But I loved the lunches my mother made for me. I wasn't eating a packed lunch and reading to pass the time because I was poor. That conviction ran deep within me, so their comments didn't bother me at all. Then, one of Cindy's entourage spoke to me. They started rambling on about how Cindy was the daughter of a major corporation CEO and would eventually inherit the company. The details I hadn't asked for. That must be tough, I replied casually. Cindy asked me in a calm voice. Are you saying that my life is tough? I tilted my head slightly. Well, I can't say for sure if it's tough for you. But if I were in your position, I'd think it's tough. Cindy bit her lip lightly. I'm rich and privileged, so it's not tough. I studied her face carefully. Being rich doesn't mean life isn't tough. Being privileged doesn't mean life isn't hard. Everyone has their struggles. Taking on the pressure of running a big company someday, isn't that tough? Cindy's eyes widened slightly as if she'd been struck by my words. Her friends chimed in, Cindy's smart, so there's no way it's tough for her. I don't think that's right. Just because someone is privileged doesn't mean their life isn't tough. You shouldn't make assumptions like that. With that, I dropped my gaze back to my book. I felt like arguing wouldn't lead anywhere. Cindy and her entourage left, seemingly unimpressed by my response. But from that day forward, Cindy started speaking to me occasionally. She'd glance at the programming books I was reading and say things like, "Do you actually understand what this says, James?" It's all Greek to me. While furrowing her brow. Sometimes, she'd say things like, I feel like having lunch outside today, but honestly, eating with so many friends, isn't that your thing, James? Whatever, it doesn't matter. Then, during lunch, Cindy appeared in front of me, glancing around nervously to make sure no one saw her. I snuck out through the small bathroom window. They're probably all looking for me right now. Hey, we can't stay here, they'll find us. Let's go somewhere else. She said this with a mischievous grin, but I shook my head and tried to reason with her. It's not fair for your friends to keep searching for you. Should I tell them you're feeling unwell? Cindy's eyes widened in surprise. James, even though they said all those mean things to you. Are you telling me it's wrong for people like that to go around looking for me? I smiled wryly and nodded. That wasn't even close to being mean enough to bother me. I then explained a harmless excuse to her group and let them know Cindy was fine. Afterward, Cindy and I shared lunch together. Soon after, Cindy openly announced to everyone that she'd be eating lunch with me from then on. She even said with a bright smile that she wanted it to be just the two of us. From that day forward, Cindy and I began having lunch together alone. Eventually, our lunches turned into something more, and we naturally began dating. Dating Cindy was pure joy. Every time we met, I found myself falling more in love with her, and Cindy stayed close by my side, always supportive. As for the future, I tried not to think about it. A rich heiress to a major company and a plain, unremarkable Japanese guy like me. There was no way it could work out in the long run. But we were young, and we didn't dwell on such thoughts. Instead, we immersed ourselves in our sweet romance. Things changed during our second year of high school. My parents decided to move back to Japan, and naturally, I had to go with them. I declared to Cindy that I would return to the US for college and come back to her. Cindy said, "Our company is aiming to expand into the IT industry. We need someone like you, James. A genius who can create games on his own. If you contribute to our company, I'm sure we'll be able to get married. So, promise me you'll come back," with such conviction that we decided to try a long-distance relationship between Japan and the US. I truly believed we could make it work. But as young as we were, we lacked the patience for it. The time difference between the US and Japan made communication challenging. Back then, international calls were not something you could make casually. Though Cindy's family was wealthy, her parents didn't allow her to spend money frivolously. They believed in raising her with grounded values. As for me, I came from a typical middle-class family. Frequent international calls and long conversations weren't something we could afford. The internet was still in its early stages, which only added to the frustration. It was Cindy who broke first. "Why don't you call me? Why are you always so tired?" she asked. I was struggling in Japan, trying to prepare for admission to an American university. The American curriculum was completely different, and just keeping up with my high school classes was hard enough. I felt bad, but my responses to her became more and more neglectful. After countless arguments, Cindy quietly said, "Goodbye." At that time, I didn't have the energy to beg her to stay. "I've met someone else." "I can't help it, we never see each other," she said. I nodded weakly. "I'll always wish for your happiness, Cindy. I'll pray from Japan for your company's success." Those were the last words I said to Cindy. And so, we broke up. Without the goal of returning to the US, I enrolled in a Japanese university and eventually joined a major company as a systems engineer. Despite my ordinary appearance, I was recognized as a genius programmer, highly valued for my technical skills and contributions to the company. Because I was so well regarded, I attracted a fair amount of attention from women, and there were times when things seemed promising. But I was naturally shy and always busy with work. Those opportunities eventually fizzled out, and I settled into a solitary lifestyle. One day, I came across shocking news. Cindy had become the CEO of her family's company after her father's sudden death. The ambitious new CEO was expanding aggressively, even acquiring a Japanese company. And she plans to further expand the business, even from Japan. I can still help Cindy, I muttered to myself. With that determination, I submitted my resignation to the company where I had worked for many years. I applied to the company Cindy's had acquired, despite having no experience in sales. During the interview, I passionately explained my reasons for wanting to join, and somehow, I got the job. The high turnover of anxious employees following the acquisition was probably one reason why an inexperienced person like me was hired. And so, here I was, struggling to secure contracts but still working as an employee of Cindy's company. When I finished telling my story to my colleagues, they were all wide-eyed with disbelief. Taking an unfamiliar job for a woman you broke up with nearly 20 years ago? That's reckless to the point of insanity, one of them said. I smiled bitterly. I think so too. Honestly, I feel like a leech, not being able to contribute much. I scratched my head and turned to face Cindy. But I'll do my best to be of help someday. Please let me keep working here. I bowed deeply to her. Cindy smiled faintly. Silly man. With that, she turned on her heel and walked toward the elevator. I've identified the main issues. I'll send you my improvement plan by next month. Leaving those words behind, Cindy stepped into the elevator and quickly left the department. Feeling a twinge of sadness, I returned to my work. After work, I found myself trudging home, lost in thought. I hadn't seen Cindy again after that. She was probably busy inspecting other floors, but she never returned to the sales department. A few hours later, I heard that the CEO had already completed her inspection and left. My heart sank. Just a little. I had allowed myself to hope, even if just a little. If she still felt nostalgic about me, maybe she'd come back to the sales department. Maybe we'd exchange contact information, at the very least. I knew she was still single. The faint hope I had that maybe, since she didn't have anyone in her life, there might still be a chance, was completely shattered. She's probably already on a plane by now. She must be incredibly busy. Flying all the way to Japan, not even sightseeing, and heading straight back. Just thinking about it made my head spin. Turning into the narrow alley, I approached the apartment building where I lived. When I casually looked up at the door to my second-floor unit, I nearly jumped out of my skin. Cindy was standing there, smiling and waving at me. "Hi. I've been waiting for you." The sight of the CEO of a massive American corporation, standing in front of the shabby door of my old apartment, dressed in a tailored dress and accompanied by a towering man who was clearly her bodyguard, was beyond surreal. I invited Cindy inside. The man beside her was apparently both her bodyguard and secretary. Cindy told him to wait outside, but I objected. However, I told him that waiting right in front of the door would inconvenience my neighbors. The bodyguard pleaded, explaining that he couldn't be separated from Cindy, no matter what, and asked if he could wait somewhere, anywhere, nearby. In the end, because Cindy insisted on being alone with me, I let the bodyguard wait in my bedroom. Having a bodyguard in my bedroom, this is so weird, I muttered while nervously making tea. Cindy laughed, her voice light and carefree. "It's his job. You could have just let him wait outside." "You're as kind as ever, James." But honestly, I wasn't being kind, I was worried about rumors spreading if a burly man loitered outside my door. Not that it mattered, given that the sight of a blonde beauty and her bodyguard at my apartment had probably already drawn plenty of attention. How do you even know where I live?" Speaking English again after so long felt clumsy. "Who do you think I am?" Cindy replied, a teasing glint in her eyes. "Right. I worked for her company, after all. That's an abuse of power." I muttered in Japanese. Cindy narrowed her eyes sharply. "You haven't changed a bit," James, still muttering in Japanese. "Whenever you don't want me to hear something." Her observation made me stick my tongue out playfully. "Well, it's convenient that you can't speak Japanese." I chuckled, but Cindy pulled out her phone. "Guess I'll let the translator handle it. Technology could be annoyingly efficient sometimes." "So, what is it?" "You tracked down my address, waited for me. You could have just met me at the office." I tried to mask my embarrassment by pouting. Even though her visit filled me with joy, I couldn't help but act composed. Cindy's eyes softened, and she looked at me with a hint of vulnerability. "James, did you not want to see me?" Her question left me speechless. The moment I arrived at the office, I heard someone say James. I turned around immediately, but you were already out the automatic doors. I tried to convince myself it was a mistake, that it wasn't you. But during the whole inspection, I couldn't stop thinking about you. I couldn't focus on anything else. I sighed deeply. I had to go apologize to a client. I wanted to call out to Cindy when I saw her, but you saw me at my worst, didn't you? I glanced at Cindy, who chuckled softly. "You shouldn't forget something as important as a contract." She teased, clearly having overheard Michael's scolding. I turned bright red. "If we were going to meet again, I wanted to look cool," I muttered. Cindy gently placed her hand on my shoulder. "You already do." Her words made me look at her. "No matter what kind of James you are, you're always cool." But if you truly wanted to support me, why didn't you come to the US? Her question made me lower my gaze. Because you broke up with me so thoroughly. Tears welled up in Cindy's eyes. But I wanted to see you all this time. I erased your number and all your contact information to move on, but the James in my heart never disappeared. No matter who I dated, no matter how much I buried myself in work, it was always you. Without thinking, I wrapped Cindy in a tight embrace. I couldn't stop thinking about you either, Cindy. I've always regretted not begging you to stay, not insisting that I wanted to go to the US. I thought about going so many times, but I was too much of a coward. I cupped her cheeks in my hands and rested my forehead against hers. Do you have someone now? Cindy shook her head. That was all the confirmation I needed. I kissed her. She kissed me back. After a sweet, lingering kiss, I gazed into her eyes. Let's start over. Tears rolled down Cindy's cheeks. Yes. Hearing her answer, we kissed again. I completely forgot about the bodyguard waiting in my bedroom. 2 years after reuniting with Cindy, I am now living in the US, not just as her husband but also as a system engineer for her company. I had thought her days were busy, but the reality far exceeded my imagination. Cindy managed a schedule packed to the minute every day, leaving no time for dates in the beginning. Back then, she was surrounded by all kinds of people. There were those who were devoted to her, those scheming to dethrone her, and those trying to ingratiate themselves with her. Particularly, those who had been loyal to her father struggled to accept her leadership. They offered her endless advice, which she found overbearing, and their attachment to her predecessor made her feel like they didn't truly believe in her. As a result, Cindy tried to handle everything herself, trusting no one to help her. It was an unsustainable way to live. I repeatedly urged Cindy to lighten her load, even just a little. Each time, she would respond with, "James, you just don't understand." Just like in high school, I told her, "Everyone loves you, Cindy. You don't have enemies. Trust them." Back in high school, Cindy's friends had been visibly disheartened when she started spending her lunches with me. When we began dating, everyone opposed it, not out of malice but because they cared about her. But all of it, the devotion, the concern, and even the opposition, came from a place of genuine care for Cindy. They simply wanted to be with her. Before her wealth or her status as an heiress, Cindy possessed an innate charm as a person. Anyone who spent time with her was drawn to that charm, feeling an irresistible desire to stay by her side and support her. I felt the same way, so I knew it had to be true. After much persuasion, Cindy finally agreed to delegate some of her work to me. When I first moved to America, I worked as her secretary. Over time, I began redistributing the tasks she entrusted to me, assigning them to the most suitable people. At first, Cindy protested, but as she saw how effectively the work was being managed, she gradually started to trust others. Now, I've stepped away from my role as her secretary and work as a system engineer instead. Being her secretary wasn't my calling. Being able to stay by her side was certainly a perk, but that's not what work is about. I usually get home a little earlier than Cindy. As I walk through the door, I'm greeted by our adorable daughter, cradled in the babysitter's arms. After giving her a big hug, I head straight to the kitchen. While the babysitter keeps my daughter entertained, I start preparing dinner. Cindy always looks forward to my cooking more than anything. So, I put my heart into making delicious meals just for her. "Your food reminds me of our high school lunches," she often says. Back in high school, those packed lunches were lovingly prepared by my mom. Sometimes, Cindy would beg me for a piece of sweet rolled omelet or an octopus-shaped sausage, and I'd happily pop it into her mouth. That memory of happiness stayed with her, and she once asked me to recreate those flavors. I called my mom for the recipes and took Cindy on a picnic where we enjoyed lunch outdoors together. Since then, I've taken over all the cooking. By the time I finish most of the dinner prep, Cindy comes home. I thanked the babysitter and sent her off, leaving the three of us to spend time together as a family. We sit down at the dinner table, sharing a happy meal and talking about the fun moments we had during the day, smiles all around.